Hello once again, everybody, and welcome to the next topic in our modern history class, modern U.S. history class, and this is going to be civil rights. This is obviously a fairly sort of significant topic in a lot of ways. Certainly, when we talk about the developments of the civil rights movement during the 50s and 60s in particular here, we can't have the sense that all the work is done, or that everything that came about from that time period, all of the advancements are even still in place, right? There's obviously a lot of work that still needs to be done in terms of race relations in the United States. It is something that is sort of a long-term challenge and struggle. And overall, progress has been made, and overall progress continues to be made, but certainly it's something that everybody should really be vigilant about and reflective of, when they approach these kinds of questions and considerations in their lives and in society in general and stuff. So what we're going to look at here is primarily the 1950s and 1960s, because that is really sort of the high watermark in a lot of respects in changes to civil rights legislation, the movement for broader levels of equality. We're going to focus in this case on the African American experience, but obviously when we get into other topics and other sections in the class, we'll cover things like feminism, gay rights, things like that, right? Because there are a number of different rights movements that take place throughout the country, especially in the second half of the 20th century. So civil rights is definitely a complicated kind of topic in many respects. It is something that, of course, stretches way back into American history. We typically think of it being primarily centered in the few decades after the Second World War, but certainly there were things going on before that. We've touched on some of those things in some of the other sections, and so here we're going to start kind of a little bit with World War II and the immediate aftermath, and then dive into the 1950s. So Franklin Roosevelt is an interesting figure in terms of a very complicated relationship with civil rights and with the black community. So he is definitely benefiting politically from a fairly widespread level of support among blacks in America during the 1930s and 40s when he's running for president. Partly this is because the New Deal institutes a number of different programs that at the very least appear to greatly benefit minority populations. Historians and economists still kind of debate in some respects just how significant and just how effective or how much impact these programs actually have on minority economies and minority populations, but at the very least the perception is there that Roosevelt cares about non-whites, that he cares about women, that he cares about groups of people who were for a long time kind of marginalized in society and politics and the economy. He personally isn't terribly familiar with issues that confront minority populations. His wife is certainly much more sympathetic. Eleanor is, in some ways, the force that sort of pushes Franklin Roosevelt in the direction of even the limited kinds of efforts towards expanding civil rights that Franklin Roosevelt implements. But he definitely does get a lot of political momentum from minority populations as he's running for president, and his programs then, in some respects, will be one of the things that will contribute to a a very clear and very solid base of support for the Democratic Party among African Americans. And this is going to last really all the way up into, in some respects, all the way up into the present. There are international issues that are happening in the 1940s and 1950s in particular that also contribute to a change in the sort of conversation about civil rights. We talked about the Cold War as a standalone kind of a topic and didn't really get into this aspect of it, but during the Cold War, there is a lot of Soviet propaganda that makes a very legitimate point of the American rhetoric that claims to be the land of the free and opportunity and all of these kinds of ideas, and yet the American system is very clearly biased against lots and lots and lots of people that live in the country. And the Soviets make a lot of hay by saying, you know, how can you claim to be the moral leader of the world when millions and millions of people that live in your country are segregated, they don't have access to equal public facilities, don't have access to equal education, their rights to vote are severely restricted, these kinds of things. And so having that mirror held up in front of people in America does, in some ways, kind of get people thinking about, well, maybe this is something that really does need to be addressed on a sort of a broader scale. And so it's not really coincidence that the real sort of surge of the civil rights movement is going to begin in the 1950s in particular, because there are a number of things that are happening in the country and in the world that are going to even just break open the conversation in ways that it hadn't been before. Probably the most famous part of the early stages of the civil rights movement, especially when you're talking about the issue of segregated educational facilities, is the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. This is one of those Supreme Court cases that people probably have heard the name of, even if they don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of it. And people probably know sort of the broad strokes about what Brown versus the Board of Education actually is all about. So it is a case that is decided in 1954, and it is part of a series of Supreme Court and federal cases that deal with access to education. Through the 1930s into the 1940s, there had been a number of other cases that dealt with segregation in areas of higher education, especially graduate level schools like law schools and that kind of thing. And so Brown versus the Board of Education ends up being the first significant Supreme Court case to deal with segregation in public schools. And it is in direct, it directly overturns the earlier case from 1896 known as Plessy versus Ferguson, right? Plessy versus Ferguson establishes that separate facilities are acceptable as long as they are quote-unquote equal. And this applies to water fountains and beach access and railroad cars and education and all kinds of things. And so the idea of segregation had been supported by the U.S. Supreme Court for nearly 60 years by the time Brown v. Board actually comes about. So the Brown v. Board case is argued in the early 1950s, and it's decided officially by the Supreme Court in 1954. And some of the arguments that are being presented by the NAACP lawyers are really, really clever, and they're really subtle, because what they're using is lots of different kinds of social science evidence, including sociology, psychology, to point out that segregation by its very nature is unequal, right? That the fact and the action of separating groups of people based solely on the color of their skin is literally an unequal proposition. And also that segregation and systemic racism more broadly does actual psychological damage to children in particular, right? There is a very famous experiment that is presented as part of the overall legal proceedings. It's known as the doll test. Basically, in the 1940s, psychologists dealt with a group of young children, children of different races, and presented them with doll babies, identical doll babies that were just different colors, that represented different skin colors, and asked the children to sort of demonstrate their preference and provide descriptions of the dolls and that kind of thing. And children referring to black doll babies would use much more critical kinds of statements, perceived those doll babies as essentially being inferior. And so the psychologists make the determination that racism is such a pervasive and such a pernicious kind of a thing that it actually makes people perceive one race as being inferior to another. And the argument then extends into segregated school systems by saying the simple action of segregating the races helps to perpetuate these kinds of perceptions of inferiority and superiority, and that those perceptions aren't necessarily just among whites who say, well, whites are better than blacks. That this is something that even passes through into the black community in this kind of subconscious, in some ways, subconscious kinds of perceptions. So Brown versus the Board of Education is a monumental, it is a landmark decision, but it is not immediately effective. It is a unanimous decision. The Chief Justice at the time is a man named Earl Warren. Warren recognizes just how big a deal this case is, and Warren says we need to make a unanimous front, right? We need all of the justices to get on board so that there's not any, possibility for people from the outside saying, well, obviously the court is not unified on the idea of desegregating schools, so, maybe we can find some kind of a legal way around it. So having a unanimous court is really important for Warren. The problem, though, is part of the court's order, part of the opinion, says that public schools are ordered to end segregation, quote, with all deliberate speed. And this is a fairly vague way of saying things, right? It doesn't say you have to do this by, January 1st of 1957, or you have to do this within 3 years from the issuance of the opinion or anything like that. It's this very fuzzy kind of thing. Well, you have to do it quickly, but you can be deliberate about it too, right? And being deliberate doesn't necessarily usually equal being quick. And so lots of feet dragging among, especially, as you can imagine, southern school districts that say, well, this is a challenging thing, we have to figure out the logistics, how do we have to build new schools to kind of incorporate all this larger population, because now we've had schools in different parts of the country housing different races, and how do we do this? And so even a couple years after the Brown decision, only a few hundred districts around the country have actually integrated. And so there's thousands and thousands and thousands of school districts around the United States that haven't bothered to make any progress towards desegregation whatsoever. The president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, we've mentioned him a little bit with regard to the Cold War, Eisenhower is kind of like Roosevelt in the sense that he's not personally all that interested in race relations or civil rights issues. Roosevelt is a Democrat. Roosevelt certainly gets a lot of political support from the African American community. Eisenhower is a Republican. He wins fairly comfortably in his two campaigns in 1952 and 1956. He does get a certain amount of the black vote, but generally speaking, except in the Deep South in particular, which is a kind of a complicated situation, generally speaking, the Democrats are the ones that receive the largest share, the lion's share of the black vote. So Eisenhower doesn't have a lot of sort of political reason to court the black vote. He's probably not going to be getting it anyway. It's probably going to be thrown behind the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates. And he personally is more of the idea that states should be making the decisions about integration themselves, right? He doesn't believe that this is something that the federal government should be involved in. He doesn't believe that personally he has the power to get directly involved. Even if he did, he wouldn't probably be all that enthusiastic about using that power. And so there is a lot of delay in actually desegregating the schools throughout the United States. One of the sort of symbolic moments where that issue changes, the question of whether Eisenhower will get personally involved in sort of pushing desegregation, happens in Arkansas. And as the school year of 1957 begins, there are 9 African American students who try to integrate the high school, the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. And they meet with lots and lots of resistance. The local community does everything in its power to prevent these students from actually attending classes. The governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orville Faubus, calls out the National Guard and actually installs the National Guard outside the building, and state police outside the building, outside the high school building, to prevent these students from getting into the building. Faubus, interestingly, in a recent election, had run as something of a more liberal candidate, but by 1957, he decides that his better political position would be to be a staunch conservative, to say, I'll never allow blacks into white school systems and white school buildings. And this then starts to become a national spectacle, right? And you see then images, photographs, news reports, radio reports, outlining exactly how this situation is unfolding. And President Eisenhower finally decides that things have gotten out of hand. And so he does a couple of different things. For one, he nationalizes the National Guard, right? He federalizes them. He takes them from the control of the state governor into the control of the President of the United States, essentially, which means then that they are required to obey the orders coming from the White House rather than from the state government of Arkansas. He also mobilizes units of the 101st Airborne Division of the United States Army, and he sends soldiers, actual U.S. Army soldiers, into Little Rock, Arkansas as part of a protection detail to guarantee that students will be able to not only get to class, not only get to the building, but also that they would be safe from any kind of violence while they're in the building and on their way home. And these are photographs. The top right is some of what were known as the Little Rock Nine, as they're making their way to class and being constantly abused verbally. There are threats of violence. There are instances of pushing and shoving and bullying and that kind of thing as they're walking to and from school. And then you can see in the left-hand photograph, this is then the 101st Airborne escorting students up the stairs into Little Rock High School, Central High School, in an attempt to enforce the U.S. Supreme Court's requirement that schools desegregate, right? Now, mind you, this is about 3 years after the court has issued its decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. But it's certainly not the first instance of desegregation in the United States. But it is one of the most famous because it does represent something of a turning point in how the process will proceed, and also something of a turning point in terms of how Eisenhower and the federal government decide to intervene in upholding the court's decision and sort of pushing states in the direction of desegregation. So that's going to be our stopping point for the moment. This section is only broken down into 2 different parts. So the next one, when we get to it, will be dealing with some of the other movements of the 1950s and 1960s, some of the prominent figures, people like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, but also some of the organizations that begin to sort of define the way the civil rights movement will proceed. So you've got things like SNCC or the SCLC or the Black Panthers or things like that. And so that's going to be where we'll get to in the next section. I will tell you it's going to be a little bit longer than this one, just because in terms of trying to find good breaking points, I couldn't really figure out a way to divide it into thirds. And so it's not exactly half and half. The second part, the second recording for the civil rights material is going to be a little bit longer, and so I apologize for that. But obviously, let me know if you've got any questions about any of this material. I'm happy to help out. Be sure that you're looking over the full PowerPoints on Blackboard as well, so that you're getting all of that content in preparation for quizzes and exams and what have you. So I hope you're all doing really well. I look forward to the next recording for civil rights, and I will see you soon.